And without further ado, I introduce Roy Hunt.
Well, thank you for being here. This is probably one of the most fun research projects I've ever undertaken. It brings together so many interests I've had over the years, and some surprisingly in this context. Many of you will remember Michael Gannon, and Michael delighted in telling New Englanders that St. Augustine was already undergoing urban renewal when the Pilgrims set foot on Plymouth Rock. Well, the Spaniards actually were in St. Augustine, and indeed what we generally call Florida, for almost 200 years before my topic picks up, because my topic is two Floridas, 1763 to 1821. And it all began with Columbus and the fallout from his first voyage to the New World. And my own fascination with this period can be dated to the 1954 midshipman cruise, when I and fellow naval midshipmen were feted in Barcelona's vast Saló Tonel, the very space where Ferdinand and Isabella received Columbus in 1492 upon his return from that voyage. A few years later, in 1961, I took a seminar with Bayless Manning at the Yale Law School titled Latin American Legal Institutions, and that furthered my interest. And this discovery by Columbus called for a new international legal doctrine to govern so-called civilized nations. For that, we can also read Christian nations. Thus, the doctrine of discovery was recognized by those nations in 1493. This doctrine provided a framework for Christian explorers in the name of their sovereigns to lay claim to territories uninhabited by Christians. Under this doctrine, indigenous peoples in the Americas were considered non-human and their lands deemed empty as a matter of public international law. Inevitably, this required a treaty dividing the spheres of influence in the New World of the Americas. And this treaty, negotiated between Spain and Portugal in 1494 in the dusty little town of Tordesillas, about 15 miles southwest of Valladolid in central Spain, bore the village's name. Apparently that village was chosen for the negotiations because of its location as a midpoint between Portugal and Spain. Has nothing else to recommend it. And a few years after being in Bayless Manning's course, I felt compelled to go to Tordesillas to see for myself. And you don't need to go, there's really nothing there. But this treaty, or with this treaty, Spain and Portugal were the only signatories, because at that time, they were the only European powers to have established a presence in the Americas. The Treaty of Tordesillas drew a north to south line of demarcation between Spain and Portugal. And last night on public television on Secrets of the Dead, the session was devoted to Magellan's explorations. And there was mention made of the Treaty of Tordesillas and the influence it had on his attempt, successful, I guess, to circumnavigate the globe, although he himself was murdered by natives along the way, so he didn't make it back with his ship, but it was indeed a circumnavigation. So there were a number of mentions last night of this topic. That line was moved 1,000 miles west in 1506 by mutual agreement. And Pope Julius sanctioned the expanded agreement of 1506. And this has led scholars to call this the papal donation. It quickly became obsolete in North America, where it affected colonization by emerging powers, particularly England and France, but also by Sweden and the Dutch. Even so, the 1494 Treaty of Tordesillas was cited by the United States Supreme Court as recently as 2005 in Sharrow versus Oneida Nation, looking at the discovery doctrine. So it is not dead. But by the year 1565, with Menendez's arrival in today's St. Augustine, the first permanent European settlement in what today is the United States, the shape of what we think of today as Florida was substantially defined. Menendez had routed the French settlement of Fort Caroline at the mouth of the St. Johns River within days of arrival in St. Augustine. And from Menendez's arrival in 1565 until 1763, there was one Florida, its administration always centered in St. Augustine. In 1763, this abruptly changed. Suddenly, there were two Floridas, a division that continued until July the 10th, 1821 for East Florida, and until July the 17th, 1821 for West Florida. So this all happened just, 200 years and 2 months ago. And the transfer that took place at that time was the subject of an event, recreation in St. Augustine on July the 10th of this year. So what led to this abrupt change in 1763? Well, most directly, it was a result of the 1763 Treaty of Paris, not to be confused with the 1783 Treaty of Paris, which brought an end to the American Revolution. So that probably will be one of the questions on the exam, the difference between those two treaties of Paris. In 1754, an undeclared war, which scholars came to call the French and Indian War, pitted colonists or colonies of British North America against those of France, each supported by military units from the parent country and by Native American allies. And on May the 17th, 1756, Great Britain formally declared war on France, and the French and Indian War became the American phase of a worldwide 9 years war, confusingly called the 7 Years' War. While the French and Indian War the outcome would determine control of the vast colonial territory of North America, the 7 Years' War was a global conflict spanning 5 continents. Churchill called it the First World War, one in which the British battled for domination over India, the sugar plantations in the West Indies, and the slave trade in West Africa. Well, Spain joined this war on the side of France, probably to their everlasting sorrow. And at the beginning of this conflict, Spain claimed only the province of Florida in eastern North America, but it already controlled Cuba and other territories in the West Indies, all of which became military objectives in the 7 Years' War. Well, with the defeat of France and its allies, including Spain in 1763, the political map of the globe was redrawn. For our purposes, it's important to know that under the 1763 Treaty of Paris, France ceded its land claims east of the Mississippi River, excluding New Orleans, to Great Britain. New Orleans was given to Spain. France ceded western Louisiana to Spain, and Spain ceded Florida to Great Britain in exchange for Cuba. Although Cuba was smaller in size and landmass, but it was more important in terms of strategic importance for Spain. The British had very cleverly gone behind all of the forts guarding the harbor in Havana and overtaken Cuba, and that's how the British had ended up with Cuba, which subsequently was swapped for St. Augustine or for Florida. So the Floridas then became officially two under the British, with capitals in St. Augustine and Pensacola. The two were separated by the Apalachicola River. Officially, East and West Florida became the 14th and 15th British colonies in North America. Yeah, we could put the map up. I think this map will leave up because I think it's helpful to refer to and for you to have a picture of just what went on in what year. Well, each of the first governors of respectively East Florida and West Florida put his own distinctive stamp on his province. Both were Scots, beneficiaries of the patronage of George III's favorite prime minister, the Scottish Earl of Bute. But their similarities seem to end here because Grant, the East Florida governor, was a bon vivant in his habits and feudal in his outlook. He believed that providing a forum for public debate in East Florida was neither necessary nor desirable. George Johnston, the West Florida governor, had the touch of the populist about him, as shown by his early summoning of a legislature. He believed that the system which prevailed in England should prevail, or in Britain should prevail in West Florida, with comparable to the House of Lords and the House of Commons. So he summoned what effectively was Commons, a legislature. An elected lower body convened in Pensacola in November 1766. But East Florida had to wait until March 1781 for a comparable institution. Well, both Floridas survived initial difficulties and by the early 1770s had discovered routes to economic viability. And just as abruptly as Britain gained the two Floridas under the 1763 Treaty of Paris, it lost them to Spain in the 1783 Treaty of Paris, which ended the American Revolution. And Spanish rule returned to the Floridas in 1784, but Spain did not reunite the two Floridas. So we still had two Floridas. Rather than bore you with forgettable dates and details of the 20-year British presence in the two colonies, which were created from a single Spanish Florida, I want to entertain you with a few memorable details about the largest single infusion of permanent settlers into the East Florida capital of St. Augustine during the British period. And then I will also talk about the visits to both Floridas during the British period by men who became celebrities. John and William Bartram, father and son, and Daniel Boone. Today, we know that large group who settled in St. Augustine in 1777, which happened to be during the American Revolution, we know that group as the Minorcans. And even today, descendants of this large group are bitterly split as to whether the word should be spelled with an I or an E. Regardless, its derivation comes from the name of the second largest of the Balearic Islands, located south of Spain in the Mediterranean, the largest of those islands being the better known Mallorca. And my research suggests that Minorca with an I is a Catalan spelling, while Minorca with an E is a Spanish spelling. Minorca with an I seems to be the preferred spelling in St. Augustine today, but you still find it both ways. So how and why did approximately 600 Minorcans suddenly show up in St. Augustine in 1777? Well, the answer lies in the entrepreneurial spirit of one man, Andrew Turnbull, a Scottish physician who later served as British consul at Smyrna, at the time in Greece, today in Turkey. And in 1765, he visited St. Augustine and secured land grants about 65 miles south of the capital, totaling more than 100,000 acres, with a view toward developing an indigo plantation. Well, this land grant was secured from Britain's first governor of East Florida, who've already mentioned, James Grant, who was a fellow Scot. And Grant was actively recruiting settlers for East Florida. In June 1767, Turnbull arrived with his ships in the Mediterranean, where he visited many islands recruiting indentured servants. Well, he successfully recruited in Italy at Livorno, in Greece at Smyrna, and in Corsica, but the majority came from the island of Minorca, resulting in this becoming the group's common name. He eventually rounded up 1,403 indentured servants or colonists and left for his new colony in East Florida, arriving there by the end of the summer of 1768. Well, although indigo production initially was very successful, life in the colony was brutal. And by the end of 1768, 450 of the colonists had died. Well, due to illness, East Florida's first British governor, James Grant, returned to England in 1771. Then arrival of the second British governor, Patrick Tonin, was a disaster for Turnbull and the colony, named for the hometown of his Greek wife, the daughter of a successful Smyrna businessman. Tonin and Turnbull had been at odds since Tonin arrived in Florida. Turnbull allegedly having announced, "I will not allow my wife and daughters to interact with Mrs. Tonin. I knew her in Scotland and she was a whore." So the gauntlet was thrown down immediately, and Tonin never forgot and he never forgave. Another St. Augustinian resident said of Tonin, "Such a vindictive nature that he had, and so self-serving that I find it really hard to like the man." Well, I was surprised, even shocked, when I heard this said about Governor Tonin in the recent PBS documentary about St. Augustine's pre-1821 history. I had long known that Governor Tonin had welcomed the 600 survivors of Turnbull's colony to a better life in St. Augustine, forcing Turnbull's lawyers to draft releases from any legal obligations under their indentures. I'd always assumed that this was because Tonin was a compassionate man. Instead, it was an act of vengeance and spelled the end to Turnbull's grand venture in Smyrna, New Smyrna. Well, this story began in 1777 when 3 of the New Smyrna colonists secretly walked and swam the 65 miles north to St. Augustine to successfully petition Governor Tonin. And soon after, Pedro Camps, the colonists' beloved priest who had come with them from Minorca, led the 600 survivors on foot to St. Augustine and the small plots assigned them near the city gate. And today you can visit the small chapel on St. George Street where he continued his ministry. But well after the British left in 1783, immigrants from Minorca continued to arrive in St. Augustine. The most interesting of these later arrivals is Esteban Benet, born in 1764 in San Felipe, Minorca. He arrived in St. Augustine in 1795 and rebuilt the existing house at 65 St. George Street with coquina. One of his 10 grandchildren was General Stephen Vincent Benet, a distinguished West Point graduate and U.S. Army officer. The general's grandsons, brothers, Stephen Vincent Benet and William Rose Benet, were both Pulitzer Prize winners. Stephen in 1929 for his epic book-length Civil War poem, John Brown's Body, which many of us were required to read in school. Today's house is reconstructed on its 1740s tabby foundation to match the appearance of 19th century photographs. And across the street is the store Pedro Benet built in 1840 and was operated by the Benet family for 50 years. It too is reconstructed on original foundations and to the appearance of 19th century photographs. So much for the Minorcans, and on to the Bartrams. On an October evening in 1765, John Bartram and his son William, at the time 29 years old, dined with East Florida's British Governor James Grant at Governor's House in St. Augustine. This would have been no ordinary dinner. Grant was known for his lavish hospitality, and his chefs were 3 enslaved Black men trained in French cooking. And during his first year in office, 1764, Grant and his guests drank 236 gallons of rum, 140 gallons of Madeira, 1,200 bottles of claret, and 519 gallons of port, not to mention beer and a few other things. And although John and William Bartram were Quakers, they were not teetotalers. And even before Bartram's, even before Britain's gain of the Floridas, John Bartram was mounting a full court press to be appointed royal botanist to King George III. And he enlisted his friend and co-founder of the Philadelphia's American Philosophical Society, Benjamin Franklin, in this effort. And in April of 1765, John Bartram received word of his appointment. And a few months later, John prepared an expedition to Florida in his new position as the king's botanist. Upon their arrival in Florida in October 1765, John and his son recorded soil types, animals, other information for would-be settlers. As I mentioned earlier, both the governors of East Florida and West Florida were actively recruiting new settlers. Well, the travels of John and William took them up the St. Johns River and almost to today's Titusville. On March 17, 1766, John left to return to his home and botanical garden that he'd established in 1728 on the Schuylkill River in King Sesson, which is a Philadelphia suburb. It's a wonderful place to visit if you have the opportunity. It's in a very unfashionable area on the wrong side of the Schuylkill, but over the years, the interpretation and the preservation has greatly improved. He left behind his son William with 500 acres on which to create an indigo plantation. Well, poor William was no businessman, and his indigo plantation effort was a failure, as were all of his commercial efforts or ventures over time. So he went back home to Daddy in Philadelphia. But this venture, although this commercial venture had failed, William had been bitten by the Florida bug, and he was particularly intrigued by accounts he had heard of the Alachua Savanna, present-day Paynes Prairie State Park or State Preserve. He was determined to return. And in 1772, William Bartram was commissioned by a British physician, Dr. John Fothergill, to record the natural history of the Southeast for the sum of 150 pounds a year. Now, at the age of 35, William returned to Florida to follow his favorite pursuit, the study of plants and animals. And from 1773 till 1777, Bartram explored the American Southeast. The account of his travels, which was first published in Philadelphia in 1791, was followed by 6 pirated European editions in different languages. His book is still in print on both sides of the Atlantic. Bartram has been called a poet in prose and the father of the Romantic movement in literature. Wordsworth eagerly read Bartram's travels and used Bartram's words in his poetry. Coleridge's Kubla Khan contains imagery from passages about our Alachua Savanna just to the south of us. Although Bartram's East Florida explorations led him as far west as the Suwannee River at today's Manatee Springs, then following the river north to today's Old Town, his 2 visits to the Alachua Savanna most excited him. And thanks to his scientific and copious notes and drawings, we can identify specific sites he visited. The river Styx, and of course that was the subject of one of Marjorie Rawlings' most famous stories, Taking the Census. The site of the Indian village at Cuscawilla in Micanopy, and apparently there's about to be a new Dollar General on that site. Alachua Sink, the Coakley Hill Audubon Sanctuary, and then his campsite within today's Kanapaha Botanical Gardens. Well, Bartram's beloved Alachua Savannah has been restored as Payne's Prairie State Preserve according to Bartram's original notes and drawings. And if you ever have the opportunity, the drawings, for the most part, are in the possession of the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia. They're deep underground in a vault, but on 2 occasions, I've been able to have them brought up, and to see the sketches of the alligators on Payne's Prairie and various other things is very exciting. So something for you to look forward to. Bartram's travels in West Florida were limited, and I'm not going to dwell on those, but when he returned to East Florida, he traveled one last time up the St. Johns River in September, and then he left Florida forever in November of 1774. He returned to Philadelphia, spent 8 months with his father before John's death in September of 1777. And he spent the rest of his long life quietly in Philadelphia, dying in 1823 at age 84. But he continued to operate with his brother the nursery that had been created by his father, John. And for those interested in that history, there's a wonderful book which details the ongoing business between John and the nursery and a dealer in London. And this went on for years, and so many of the great gardens in England are populated with plants that John sent pursuant to this arrangement. Well, I want to move to a very different kind of person and his period in Florida, Daniel Boone. As a final celebrity visitor. The two could not have been more different because Daniel Boone was certainly not a celebrity at the time he visited Florida. It was not until he was 50 years old that he was mythologized by an author named John Filson, who really created the Boone that we know from movies and TV shows. His publication was, again, in 1784, was The Adventures of Colonel Daniel Boone. As an example of his mythology, Filson created the image of Boone in a coonskin cap or hat. And there's reliable evidence that Daniel Boone never wore a coonskin cap or hat. And I grew up in Tennessee with Filson's mythology, and I thought I knew everything about Daniel Boone. I was wrong, and I recall vividly the moment I first learned that Boone's life history included Florida. 2 or 3 years earlier, I had explored Cumberland Gap, where I bought a Boone biography in the National Park Service's bookshop. Reading it was plainly not a priority, but at midnight one night, around 1985, the time had come for something serious enough to put me to sleep. Instead, when I read about Boone's Florida escapade, I almost fell out of bed. The next morning, I excitedly called Sam Proctor, whom many of you remember, leading historian on the UF faculty and the creator of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, from which we've benefited so much. So I called Sam to share my discovery. And as usual, Sam quickly deflated me with, "Oh, Roy, everybody knows that." Well, not everyone knew that. When I shared it with Michael Gannon, he included the episode in his 1993 Florida, A Short History on page 21. So what brought Daniel Boone to the two Floridas? Well, in the late summer of 1765, 5 of Boone's old militia companions from General Burgoyne's, General Braddock's disaster at Fort Duquesne, basically Pittsburgh, all from Culpeper County, Virginia, rode into North Carolina's Yadkin Valley and the home of Daniel Boone. They said, passing through North Carolina on their way to the new British colonies of East Florida and West Florida, where the royal governors of the new entities were offering land to new Protestant immigrants. Boone, his younger brother, Squire, and his brother-in-law, John Stewart, happily accepted an invitation to join the 5 Virginians. And before leaving, Boone promised his wife, Rebecca, that he would return in time for Christmas dinner, which was always at noon. The trip south was something of a frolic for these now 8 young men. And one of them happened to be a Virginian named Slaughter, who was an expert gambler, and his winnings financed the trip, according to Boone's youngest son, Nathan. And as I was doing this research, and I ran across the name Slaughter from Culpeper County, it occurred to me that I know his descendants. And so I got in touch with the Slaughters in Culpeper to confirm this family history. So as I say, I just kept running across connections. I had visited the Slaughters on my way to New Haven when I entered Yale. Drank mint juleps on their terrace overlooking the valley there in Culpeper County. So planning to hunt along the way, the group traveled south to Fort 96 in South Carolina, and then to Savannah, and from Savannah on to St. Augustine. And it's highly likely that Daniel Boone was in St. Augustine at the same time as John and William Bartram, certainly the same year. But unlike the Bartrams, there's no account that he and his companions were wined and dined by Governor Grant. Boone was not yet a celebrity, and Governor Grant was extremely class conscious. Well, the expedition did not go well. At one point, they became hopelessly lost in a dark boggy mire, and nearly starved to death before a band of Seminoles found them and nourished them with venison and honey. Then, thinking they might have better luck in West Florida, the troop made their way to the Panhandle part of Florida. And there, Boone was so entranced, so enamored with the beauty of the enclosed bay, Pensacola Bay, that he impulsively purchased a house and tract of land, planning to return to Florida with his family to settle in the West Florida capital. From the Panhandle, the group explored their way north, taking a route through the Creek Indian country that would be traveled by William Bartram a few years later and described in his classic prose. And as an aside, I thought for many years that Boone's failure to write about his travels were due to illiteracy. But I've since learned that a sister-in-law had taught him reading, writing, and basic mathematics. He simply chose not to write. A reader, he rarely traveled without a copy of his favorite book, Gulliver's Travels. So the group reached Augusta and then the Savannah River. And then as he got close to his home in the Yadkin Valley, he slowed his pace. And on Christmas Eve, he hung out in the woods near his home. And then at the appointed time for dinner, Christmas dinner, noon, he strode into the house I'm not sure he had a watch. I'm sure he didn't have a watch. But anyway, we're told he strode into the house on the stroke of noon. And immediately, Rebecca's surprise turned to horror when Daniel announced that he had bought land in Florida and the family was moving to Florida. And according to Nathan, the youngest son, the youngest of the Boone boys, Rebecca flatly refused to move to Florida. And migration to Florida was abandoned and the property was sold. Well, a few years ago, I was speaking to a large historical society in Pensacola, and I shared the Daniel Boone saga. And then at the end, I asked for a show of hands of those who knew Boone had almost become a Pensacolan. And out of that large group, only 3 hands went up, shot up. So it's not a well-known story. You now know the story and you can pass it on. Daniel Boone was almost a Floridian. Well, 1783 arrived, and just prior to that, in 1778, France had returned to North America with the establishment of a Franco-American alliance against Great Britain in our American Revolutionary War. And in 1779, France also entered the war on the Patriot side. By 1781, and if you're taking a look at that map up on the screen, you can see how these changes occurred. Look particularly at West Florida. By 1781, Spain had recaptured all of West Florida, and the westernmost boundary was the Mississippi River. And you can see how far north the holdings went. In the 1783 Treaty of Paris, which ended the American Revolution, East Florida was also returned to Spain. But Michael Gannon has pointed out that Spain's second occupancy of Florida, really the 2 Floridas, which Spain did not seek to reunite, was tenuous at best. It was clear from the beginning that West Florida could not long withstand the expansion ambitions of the United States, the infant USA. And Spain's enforcement of immigration in West Florida proved its, I should have said Spain's encouragement of immigration into West Florida proved its undoing, because the more Anglo-Americans poured in from the north to take advantage of the land grants offered by Spain, the more the local population became non-Spanish. And in turn, West Florida became more independence-minded. And the inevitable happened. In 1810, the Anglo-Americans in Baton Rouge established a government of their own, declared themselves the Republic of West Florida. And you can see that on the map. Then President Madison seized on this event by annexing the lands between the Mississippi and the Pearl River. In 1813, the U.S. annexed the remaining lands of West Florida as far east as the Perdido River, and that's the present western boundary of today's state of Florida. In East Florida, meanwhile, there were several independent governments founded in and around the town of Fernandina on Amelia Island. And there's a vast literature on that. Amelia Island pushes the fact that it was the only place in the United States that was once under 8 different flags. Some of them pretty obscure, but anyway, there's an interesting literature on that if you want to pursue it. One is, I think, titled Florida Fiasco. Well, the clearest indication of Spain's weakness in the 2 Floridas came in the War of 1812 and in the First Seminole War. Spain had no alternative but to get out of the 2 Floridas, and so they were seeking the best terms available. And to that end, in 1819, Spain's minister to the United States, Don Luis de Onís, and U.S. Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, signed a treaty of cession by which, in return for the 2 Floridas, the United States assumed $5 million worth of Spanish debts to American citizens. Well, it was 2 years before this treaty was finally ratified in both Madrid and in Washington. But as a result of that formal transfer of East Florida to the United States, again, that occurred on July the 10th, 1821. Then a week later, a formal transfer of West Florida occurred in Pensacola on July the 17th with Andrew Jackson in attendance. So this new possession of the United States formally became the territory of Florida on March the 4th, 1822, thus marking the end of the 2 Floridas. And that is the end. Thank you. So, are there any questions? Hearing none, thank you for being here.
Wait, let me just double
Okay.
check. Let me double check. Anybody on Zoom? Anyone in the Oak Room? Well, please join me in thanking
Roy,
Roy.
Roy, I did have one question. Daniel Boone, I always thought he was more associated with Tennessee, or was that Davy Crockett? Did Boone have any connection with Tennessee at all?
He, yes, he was more associated with Kentucky. He was born in
Kentucky, yes.
Yeah, he was born in Pennsylvania. Then the family moved down to the Yadkin Valley of North Carolina. And then he was hired to lead an exploration seeking a way to the west, and that was Cumberland Gap. And so it was through that particular spot that he led settlers to Kentucky in particular. He was never successful as a businessman. At one time or another, he owned a lot of land and was wealthy, but something always happened. And he did not like civilization, and so he tried to keep ahead of it. And he eventually moved to west of, I can't call the name of it right this minute, Missouri. And Missouri at the time he moved there was Spanish possession. And his son, named for his brother Squire, had moved there. And so Daniel and his wife followed them there. And he built a house there that I have visited a couple of times. It's a beautiful house. I would call it federal architecturally. And he hand carved the mantelpieces in walnut, and they really are Adamesque in style. It's really a wonderful house. And that's where he died. His son, his son, Squire, had returned to, I can't remember whether it was North Carolina, Pennsylvania, I believe Pennsylvania. And eventually, Boone's body was exhumed and reburied back in North Carolina or Pennsylvania. But again, he had he always wanted to stay ahead of civilization. But he was known, certainly in Tennessee, he was in Tennessee, but most importantly, opening up Kentucky.
Uh-huh. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. We have Richard Pettway now.
Richard?
I'd like to elaborate a little bit on the Missouri because my grandfather, who immigrated from Louisiana County, Virginia, started inhabiting Booneville, Missouri, which is on the Missouri River, and became the place of exodus for the Santa Fe Trail and the Oregon Trail. So Independence, Missouri is one of the stopping places, but it is not the origination of those trails. It's Booneville, Missouri. And lo and behold, my grandfather, who got his doctorate degree from UVA, subsequently was born in Booneville, and I taught at the University of Missouri for a while, which is very close. Columbia is very close, but it's east of the Missouri River, and Booneville is on the Missouri River. So it was a unique town that had a frontier past, and I don't know that Boone ever came to Booneville, but there are a number of places that have Boone's name associated in Missouri. So he must have been, and in fact, where he was buried, there was discussion about Missouri trying to enter a claim to his body, but it was decided that was other choices were available. But it's interesting to relate Boone the adventurer in Florida and everywhere else in the Midwest to this Booneville, Missouri, that is historically related to the expansion westward by wagon trains to Santa Fe and to Oregon.
Well, one of the places that's named for him that I recall visiting was called Boone's Lick.
Yeah, that's
in
true.
Missouri. But again, it's really a fascinating part of the Boone history. So are there any other comments?
Boone's Lick was a salt depository.
Yeah.
Yeah, why was Cuba or Havana so important to the Spaniards?
Oh, it was the centerpiece for trade in that part of the world. It was extremely, it was the Miami of today. All of the trade and the ships that came from South America laden with gold and what have you stopped off there. It was a major route. So Florida was of very little consequence compared to Cuba strategically for Spain, which of course was active everywhere except in Portugal and Spanish America. That's why it was of great strategic importance. St. Augustine was not. So they were desperate to get Havana back.
You want to give us a preview of next week's session, Barbara Wingo?
Well, next week we're beginning, I guess, a series of 3 talks related to Marjorie Canaan Rawlings. And Barbara Wingo is the current president of the Friends of MKR Farm. And she is going to talk about what's going on there. And then I believe we're doing a documentary by Donna Green Townsend. Some of you may remember her. She was a longtime member of the journalism faculty and has done a documentary on Rawlings. So that will be next week. And the following week, Flo Turcotte, who is the archivist for the Rawlings collection at the University of Florida, will be talking about Marjorie. And then I believe our last session, we're going to show the movie, The Yearling, which is celebrating the 75th anniversary of its premiere. That history of the movie is the subject of a long article by Barbara in the new issue of the newsletter of the Friends of MKR Farm. And I hope, well, I will ask her to talk about that, because the yearling that we will see was many years in the making. The first attempt was with Spencer Tracy playing Pa, and an actress unknown to me as the first Ma, and of course a different Jody. For whatever reason, and there were a number of reasons, that first effort didn't work. I had heard for years that it was because Spencer Tracy was an alcoholic, but there seemed to have been a lot of other issues as well. In any event, after a lot of money spent and time spent, that first attempt to film it was scrubbed. And then later, a director, Clarence Brown, took over and discovered Jody in a classroom in a public school in Nashville. And Jody, or Claude Jarman Jr., will be here for a couple of events. He has grandchildren who recently graduated from UF. He lives in South Florida. And so he will be on the stage after the showing of the movie in Ocala at the Historic Theater there. He will also be out at the farm, I believe, the next day. But again, we're going to have our own showing of the original film here as the last part of the last presentation in the series. So